Hello everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Dreams to Realty Property Insights. Today we've got Susan Farquhar, special guest back again. She's the MD at Cala Property. I'm so excited to have Susan on the show because there is so much stuff or news to talk about at the moment. We've just had the budget, the Australian federal budget, released yesterday. There's of course the interest rate rise from earlier in the month, which we're going to focus on in today's episode, where we're going to talk about risk profiles, inflation and interest rates. Now, it's so easy to wake up in the morning and think about the doom and gloom and how difficult things are, because that's how the media frames it, because guess what? Greed and fear sells headlines, okay? That's basically it. But these things like inflation and interest actually have two sides to the coin. And that's why I want a specialist like Susan to help us understand this and how we can make it work for us, depending on what our risk profiles are and what our financial objectives are in moving forward in our future and looking back at our past. Because that's what we need to focus on, what you want, where you fit into the whole game, the investment game. Now, before we proceed, just to let you know, there is a disclaimer here. Anything that's mentioned in the podcast is not financial advice. It's just a discussion. We're getting information out there. We're learning from Susan's years of experience in the industry. But if you want personal financial advice, we can't offer it because we don't know what your objectives are or what your personal financial situation is. So seek out a reputable financial advisor to help you with that and make an appointment. Up on the board, we've got the Cala Property website, so you can easily find them at calaproperty.com.au. That's Cala, that's C-A-L-L-A. So there are a stack of economic data points that we should be looking at, metrics like CPI, inflation, interest rates, unemployment figures. All this stuff gets released monthly and quarterly. And, if you're not in business and finance every day, you're like, that's above my head. And I don't blame you. But I was reporting for 2 years and I was watching Bloomberg every day. And guess what? You can catch on. This stuff is cyclical. It's repetitive. You learn to understand how it affects each other, how it correlates, how it impacts investments and industries. And by listening to the right experts, you can gain further insights. So there's also the geopolitical and the socioeconomic factors that we're going to discuss today, things like population growth. And you need to hear it more than once. So these things become more familiar to you and you start to work out what it means and how it impacts your decisions. So it comes a point in everyone's life when we think about the future, okay, hopefully sooner than later. And no wonder we're getting creative with where we live. I mean, our shelter is a basic need, okay? Yet it's a huge economic asset and people are investing in it every day. And sometimes we forget about, the crux of it. It's something we need, okay? And people are getting creative, living in vans, going off grid, living on couches, but how long can you seriously do that for? So if you get your finances in order, if you get your risk profile and what you want yourself in order, maybe you can make some decisions that might assist your future. So we're going to talk to Susan now. I'll bring her up to the stage and she will share insights from her experience operating, founding, managing, directing Cala Property. This is Susan Farquhar. Let's pick her brain. No, just kidding. We'll get her insights. Susan, I'm going to invite you up to the stage.
Great. Hello. Hi, it's good to see you again, Sage.
Hi, Susan.
How are you going?
Very good, thanks. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Pleasure.
So, Susan, I've got this picture of an Airbnb treehouse up here. Like, these things don't go cheap anymore. How much would something like that be?
Oh, I guess it depends on the location, but it looks like fun, hey? I reckon
Wouldn't
it'd
it be fun?
be, a cool place to stay. If you're on travel, if you're traveling around Australia or wherever you're going, and having a couple of days in a treehouse, I think could be lots of fun. I've got a friend who actually fantasizes about living in a treehouse, but I don't know how practical it would be with lots of shopping and kids and prams and things like that. I guess you'd leave them down the bottom, but yeah, they're expensive, and interesting types of assets like that for Airbnb style travel is increasingly, has an increasing market share as people get sick of staying in boring hotels, or they've found that the townhouses or apartments or houses that they have been renting out are actually not that nice to stay in. I know for myself, when I'm traveling for work, I never stay in an Airbnb because I'm not confident that the bed's going to be comfortable, the linen, the quality of the finishes. And it's just like, I just don't need that when I'm working because I work such long hours. But when I'm traveling with my family, often it's prohibitive to have a 2-bedroom or, a property type that is suitable for a family. So an Airbnb financially makes a lot more sense. And often you actually get to feel like you're more of a local, and that can actually be quite interesting. So I think, there are different people are getting creative with just trying to solve their own personal shelter requirements, but they're also getting very innovative when it comes to investment types as well, investment assets to make money from, that are helping to combat the ordinary, cost of goods going up because of inflationary pressure. And, $100 doesn't feel like $100 anymore. It's gone before you know it, and then, in the rental crisis in Australia, rising interest rates like you've touched on, and even rising interest rates across an investment portfolio. When you have a property portfolio that might be, let's say overall it's yielding, say 4 to 5%, which would be pretty typical of a good investment portfolio, and interest rates are 6%, already there's a discrepancy there, and that's before any costs associated with holding the property. Now, we know that investing in property is one of the safest and the best performing asset classes, but that is only true if you can afford to hold on to it. If holding on to that property adversely affects your lifestyle too much, then you'll just go, this is too hard. I can't actually hold on to this anymore. And you are often forced to get rid of it, even if that's at a loss. And we don't want that, obviously, for investors.
Exactly. Thank you for that insight. And it's those knee-jerk reactions to things that can sometimes throw you. So I guess by just having some really careful due diligence on the lead up to the purchase, you can prepare with buffers and things. But Ceci, can we talk about that and buffers and what our goals are and how long we'd like to keep properties for in our next question? How would you define a risk profile and for property investment, and what sort of factors in particular should be considered when considering this?
It's a very, very interesting question. And I think there is not any really simple response. Obviously being at the forefront of this for, decades, actually more than years now, decades, and seeing how different clients respond to information and respond to things like, borrowing capacity. Okay, let's just take that as an example, because I think that's quite an interesting one, where the bank has said, okay, you can borrow $1 million, for example, and then the client says, oh, but we don't want to borrow that much. Go, okay, well, why wouldn't you, right? Because one of the best parts, or one of the reasons why investing in property is such a great asset class, is your ability to leverage the debt from the bank. You can put in your 10% or 20% if you don't want to pay LMI, lender's mortgage insurance. You can put in the deposit that the bank requires, then borrow the rest from the bank, pay that off as interest only for as long as you possibly can, which is usually what we would recommend. But again, I agree with your disclaimer, depends on the circumstances and depends on the client. But then at the end, you take all the profit and just get rid of the loan, right? So why wouldn't you spend, and if you look at it from a compound interest perspective, right, over the last 25 years in Australia, property has compounded at 6.8% on average nationally, right, for houses, 5.9% for apartments. So for houses at 6.8%, and say you've got an investment horizon of 20 years, if you look at the compounding effect of borrowing $1 million and investing in $1 million asset as opposed to an $800,000 asset or $500,000 asset, over time, that compounding effect has a huge end result, right? A massive differential. You see it with ad campaigns that we have running at the moment in regards to superannuation, putting it in an industry super fund as opposed to a commercial fund, and just the difference with fees and how that can erode your end result over time. Now, I've often, I write about this a lot. I've got an article on my blog. I do it in my training for staff as well, that when a bank says you can borrow $1 million, they've already de-risked it for them. So that means they've de-risked it for you. Okay, the bank's not lending you 100% of the property value. Let's say you're investing in a property that if by any chance you defaulted, they could get rid of like that. Then they will borrow up to 90%. They'll lend up to 90% in most cases. But if they deem that asset class to be a bit riskier, such as, at the other end of the scale, we're looking at, say, a income producing beef, cattle station out in Broken Hill, right, miles away, you might only be able to borrow 50% of the borrowing, and they're going to take into account the income producing part of it and look at the interest cover of the previous net profit, right? So the bank's already de-risking the asset. They're de-risking the location. They're de-risking you as a borrower, right? So depending on what your credit score's like, if you've had any defaults, what's your position with the tax department, all of these things are now coming into play. Then they're looking at the income associated with the property. With the rental income, they're going to discount that depending on the policy of the lender, because every lender, has slightly varying policies relating to things like how they use rental income as allowable income. Some lenders will discount that to 70% of the value, saying, well, in this area, we have assessed that property as being vacant for 2 to 3 weeks or 4 weeks of the year. So therefore, we're going to, discount that. If you are relying on income from overseas, they're also going to discount that to allow for foreign exchange fluctuations. So by the time they actually get to the point of giving you the borrowing capacity, it's already been through the ringer. You don't have to further de-risk that for yourself, right? But still, even if you explain that to clients, they go, I'm still not happy with the debt. So that's where you start to see the risk profiles come into play. We've got clients that can borrow, say, $4 million. And in that scenario, we could usually recommend starting with a portfolio of 5 to 6 properties that are as de-risked as I think they could possibly be through the research that we do, but also diversified across different states, different areas, so that you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, different property types as well. And but then you'll get clients who go, I just really know my local area. So, this is where I live, this is where my mum lives, and this is where my sister lives in this kind of inner west suburb or eastern suburbs. And I really know that area. I go, okay, so you think you know the area. What infrastructure is coming to the region, right? What is the unemployment rate like? What is the population growth rate looking like in this specific area? Okay, I don't know. What about the vacancy rate? Okay, and then I have to kind of show my clients that when they come to me with when clients come to me, they're not saying I want a house in Brisbane. They're saying I've got $900,000 to invest. What would you recommend based on your research and based on what building your dreams, which is our tagline, means to them? And that's what we're trying to unpack when we're then matching their dreams with our, de-risked property, but it's dependent on their structure, their strategy, and then their budget. So that's where we start to see risk profiles come into play. So, and then, but we're trying to diversify the risk across the portfolio by choosing different, areas and properties that will have different growth risks and different cash flow risks in relation to rent. And there's always a bit of a balance between the cash flow and the growth. So yeah, we come across that all the time, and it does influence people's decision about what they invest and how much they invest, but usually because I don't think they've had much of a look at what maybe haven't understood what their risk profile is, or their advisors are not people that who are in the industry. Their advisors are Uncle Bob at the barbecue, or Mum, or people that aren't doing this for a living day in day out. And like you said to me earlier in a chat, being part of being a reporter for Bloomberg for 2 years, seeing the cycles. You don't see that unless you're in it all the time, and you can feel it. Yes, it's data driven, but you can feel it coming because the data moves in a pattern, and so that's why you can feel it. But it's actually just learning how to interpret the data.
That's so true and so well said. Thank you. But I'll just mention I was watching Bloomberg. I wasn't actually reporting for Bloomberg. But I did interview a reporter from Bloomberg, and they're very talented people from that channel. But yes, Susan, thank you for that, because I think when people see that big debt and it's going to be with them for 20 or 30 years, and on top of that debt, they're paying $200,000 worth of interest, for the span of the loan, or the loan horizon, as you put it. That can be quite daunting, especially when people were buying houses for $50,000 to $100,000 50 years ago, and now we're paying much bigger sums of money. But I guess our wages have also increased considerably since the 1970s. So how do inflation and interest rates impact risk profile of property investors, as well as the market overall? So inflation's not always a bad thing for investors, and nor is interest rates. Is that correct, depending on which end of the spectrum you are?
Yeah, look, I think it just depends on what you're trying to do with your money. I think really the key is understanding the cash flow associated with the debt, right? And I think that's where people really fall over. I think in Australia we have 2.05 million investors, yet only 71% of those, that cohort, will invest in more than one property. Now, to me, that shows that they don't understand property, right? They don't understand, or they might understand property from a home perspective, but not from an investment perspective. So, I guess, referring to what property cost 20 years ago is actually a very good indicator of a good way to think about it, of where property is going in the next 20 years, The average house in Australia a year ago was $571,000. And in 20 years' time, based on the 6.8% capital growth rate, it's going to be $2.9 something million, right? So yeah, we can retrospectively do that as well and go, okay, well, 20 years ago, it was probably worth 90,000, and you're probably right. But the cash flow was probably the same. Interest rates were much higher, but rents were also lower, so where does that end? It's about understanding what you're doing with it now, and what do you want to achieve with that property. And then, do you want to grow a portfolio? And if so, we set up the structures differently for that. We need to know that. But getting back to how does it impact? It impacts massively, because what you're really saying, just to kind of unpack it a little bit further, when interest rates go up, your borrowing capacity goes down. Okay. Now, we know that there is an absolute direct correlation between interest rates rising and property prices rising and property prices declining, and your ability to access money. Now, in the previous cycle, it was the first cycle that I have looked at over a long time, where the property market declined in a very low interest rate environment, right? Interest rates were like 2 to 3%. Okay, so why did that happen? And it happened really because of the Royal Banking Commission. Banks were terrified of lending, and they wanted to really make sure that everything was stacked up correctly. And it took banks a lot longer to get loans approved for clients, because they had so many more policies in place that they weren't familiar with, that they needed to put in, different checks and balances. And so if you can't get money, you can't buy a house, right? It's really simple. So when you can't get money and you can't buy a house, you can't borrow money to invest in a house, then the market starts to decline. And that's where you go into a correction phase, where the market's correct, the price is correct, and it needs to happen. It's also the play of macroeconomics, where it's just basic supply and demand, where, microeconomics, where, if you outprice the market, then people just don't buy, right? And even though you might have people putting the properties on the market, because they've got an overinflated sense of what it should now go for, they just go, well, no, I'm going to pass it in. And then a year later they go, damn it, I should have taken the money, because they're not good at or experienced in reading the markets in the way that I am, for example. So, people say, oh, but how can you ever tell what the timing of the market is? And it's like, to me, it's actually pretty obvious, right? Because I know how to read those cycles. So interest rates play a huge part in how you respond, right? Now, when we're used to having an interest rate environment of, say, under 5%, and suddenly it's gone from, well, even under, say, 4%, and then it's creeping up. And also, I think it was 11 interest rate rises in quick succession. Bang, bang, bang. That's the most I think we've ever had. So without any reprieve, right? And then to have 1 month of staying the course, and then it's gone up again. It's just like, oh, come on, really? And part of the reason why it went up again is because everyone flocked back into the property market, right? People want to invest in property. They've got money, but that's one of the biggest inflationary costs, the biggest inflationary drivers. So, so the Reserve Bank said, no, stop spending your money, and big money on houses. And this is really different to what happened after the GFC, right? So the downturn after the GFC was a market that had been built on credit, whereas now there's so much liquidity in the market that the spending hasn't stopped, and therefore the government is kind of forced to put the brakes on.
Wow, that's very valuable information you just gave us there. And just drawing back to the 11 consecutive interest rate rises,
I think it is. Don't quote me on that. I can't quite remember what it was. I was reading it the other day, but it's not about that.
11 or 12, but apart from the previous month where they sat steady. But before we had this big run of increases, I think there was no increases for about a decade. So that's what the market was like. And I think before COVID, the prices that they were expecting prices to shoot up, but they were expecting prices to go down, but then the prices shot up instead because of the fact that people were just, I'm not exactly sure what made the prices go up during COVID, actually.
That's actually really funny. I was, who was it? I think it was, can't remember if it was The Project or, oh no, it was 2GB. Okay, 2GB rang me and said, can you help us make sense of this headline? And it was, prices to decrease by 40%. And I'm like, okay, let me have a really good look at the article, because mostly I don't bother too much with that kind of news. I'm as much at the news as anybody else, and I kind of know what the data is that sits behind this if I care to look at it. But mostly I don't bother with that unless a client brings me an article or other media channels or, producers bring me the article going, what does this mean? So that was a headline that was in the Australian. And when you read the fine print, it was auction clearance rates expected to go down, not prices, auction clearance rates. Now, of course, we're locked down. People can't go to an auction, and we hadn't yet pivoted. Okay, we hadn't yet understood how we could do auctions online, and no one believed that that could work. Right? I didn't think for a second that I could run my business on, without an office, with people seeing me face to face, and because it's such an important, trusted relationship and conversation. But no one meets me face to face anymore. We have the entire team working virtually, and now I've got clients from all over Australia and all over the world, rather than being a bit more specifically geo-locked into where the office was, right? So yeah, it wasn't, I don't know that actually is really true, that people expected it to go down. I think what I noticed is that when the pandemic hit, people really just froze, right? More than anything else, they just froze. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to do it. They didn't know what was going to come. That was true, I think, in most sectors. They certainly weren't interested in investing or doing anything really. Certainly weren't, people that had travel booked or was going to book travel just going, well, we can't do that. We'll just stop until we know what's going on. And then as we started to understand it, then we're like, okay, what do we do now, right? And I think there was still a sense of let's just wait and see in terms of the investment landscape. But then the Australian government introduced a $25,000 grant for new build and renovation, because the construction industry, the construction sector, is a huge part of our economy. So that was a way of making sure that part of the economy was still ticking over, because as we're handing out money, left, right and centre, something's got to pay for it at some point, right? So, but that $25,000 did so much to spur on it was an explosion of new building and renovation. Now, normally that would have been fantastic, but it just happened in a bubble where suddenly we had supply chain issues with terminals locking down, and it just had it was quite a slow moving knock-on effect. And then suddenly there were no supplies, and then the big retailers that are also wholesalers, like Bunnings, for example, the builders have good relationships with these suppliers, and they know that they have these, fixed price contracts, and they have everything quoted up and supplied and locked away for them at that price until they build it, knowing that the build's about 6 months, 8 months away. But then when you don't have people who can get on site to do civils, and you don't have the engineers who can sign off on it because all the foreigners have gone back home, you don't have, people working in councils. It just had a huge, far-reaching knock-on effect that kind of goes beyond supply chain as such. It's more the ecosystem with which it was operating. So houses weren't getting built as quickly as people wanted to build them. So therefore, you're not creating the stock. No one can go anywhere. So in the census that was done during lockdown, was the most subscribed census we've had in Australian history, and 1 million houses were unoccupied at the time of lockdown, that night of census, right? So 1 million around the country. That's huge for this country to have so many houses that were unoccupied. So, I think, and then you've got the rental crisis. I think that's where you sort of need to start thinking a little bit laterally around how we help solve that, right? And some councils have, down the South Coast, the mayor wrote individually to every single owner of those properties and said, can you please rent them to our population rather than relying on Airbnb, because we need them. These people don't have a place to live. They're in the school hall and, in tents, and it's just an awful environment, and having far-reaching consequences for mental health and all kinds of things, So, yeah, it is interesting, why I don't think anyone actually, if you really unpack that headline, I don't think anyone did think they were going to decline by 40%. I think it was just a misquoted headline. And like you said, fear and greed sell headlines. So, scare the horses and we'll buy the headline, but without actually reading it. It's just like, look what's going to happen. The sky is falling. But yeah, it was a very specific set of circumstances that we're now starting to come out of. We're now starting to see that movement again. But we still are dealing with the inflation that is just about having so much liquidity in the market.
Thanks, Susan. So just going back to what you were saying before about the woman or the people that you come across who'd rather stay in their local area because they feel emotionally attached to it, they feel it's familiar, but they haven't actually looked at the facts and the data that surrounds the area and things like vacancy rates and unemployment rates. I mean, the federal budget in Australia in 2023 is trying to support housing affordability and people in welfare who are being affected by these hyped up rentals caused by the high interest rates people are paying on their mortgages, perhaps, and the vacancy rates. But if you're just leading with this intuition rather than being data driven and looking at the analysis of what's going on in the area, I guess you can find yourself in some tight situations, and that's why people approach specialists at Colour Property like yourself who can help them, I guess, to work out what to look at and what to take into account when addressing their risk profiles. At the moment, I think they're bringing in some cost of living allowances to certain groups of people. I'm not sure who's actually going to get that yet. And I think with the previous government, the Morrison government, they not only did the $25,000 first homeowner grant that you were talking about, I think they also did the SMSF initiative where people could buy houses with SMSF. So I understand you're quite well versed in that. Did you have any insight to share on that and how it impacted the market?
Yeah, so just on that, so it wasn't a first home buyers grant, the 25,000, it was a home builders grant, and that was available to anyone. The home buyers grant is a state-run tax or grant rather. It's run through the state's Office of State Revenue, and it's state specific, right? So in some states it's 10,000, in some it's 20. Sometimes there's an incentive to go to regional areas, and so it's doubled for a period of time. Sometimes when they're trying to get investors back into the area, they cut stamp duty for investors for a period of time. Now for SMSF, that was actually done a long time ago. That was done in, I think it was 2003. That was the first time that you were allowed to buy property using your SMSF. And they bought, I think at the same time, they brought in non-recourse loans for SMSF borrowers. So that's a bit more convoluted. That's like how some states in America run, where there is no recourse, but basically meaning if you default on your loan, you can walk away, right? It's not going to have any default implications on your personal profile or your credit score. But in terms of how that's impacted, look, I think really the question here is more about basic needs. You know, like you did say that housing is a basic need and shelter is a basic need. Some countries do treat property in terms of it being an asset class as being a basic need, and you do not get the tax benefits, you don't get the capital gains tax cuts, you know, it is a basic need. And I think this, if the government is really wanting to tackle this, it's a structural thing. It's not a handout, it's not a cost-cutting thing. It is, or some sort of means-tested thing. I think there has to be a different responsibility, right? I think that it's probably the government needs to be building more social housing. But that's the thing too, is that really part of the reason why investors get so many cuts is because investors provide rentals for a lot of the Australian population. The government isn't doing that enough, right? It's providing a lot of crisis housing, not enough either, but some crisis housing, but not enough social housing, and not enough just housing in general for ordinary people to access, right? It shouldn't have to be for really, really low incomes. So that has an effect, right? That, you know, if property is a favourable asset class for Australians to invest in, and it's extraordinary. You know, you've got the ability to leverage, you've got the tax minimisation benefits. It's such a reliable asset class where it grows year on year. over a period of time, then, you know, you can't go too far wrong really with property. And even if it makes a loss, as long as you have enough income personally, you're getting the tax benefit of the loss, right? So that means you take home more of your pay after, you know, before tax. So, yeah, it's a very interesting one. It's probably a lot more nuanced than that, and something that has to happen structurally rather than, you know, anything else. But I think, look, going back to what makes for a good investment, yeah, how do you help people understand that if they're going to feel comfortable? And for me, it's really just about showing them the numbers. It's like, okay, yeah, you can buy this property in this location. Chances are, you know, it's not necessarily going to be the best bang for your buck. You might not have the right rental yield. You might be subject to more expensive costs, like say it's a secondhand property. So brand new property is a lot more beneficial for investors because you can't get full tax depreciation on secondhand property, right? Even if it's just been owned for a day, if it's been previously owned, you just can't. So we always recommend new property. And new property as well has all the tax benefits. You get the structural and minor defects warranties from day one, all of the appliances warranties from day one, and you don't really expect to have any costs related to the property for, you know, a good 10 years, I would say. Whereas if you're buying a secondhand property, I mean, not only have I made all the mistakes for my investors, you know, when I was young, I see it all the time. You know, I see clients that go, you know, and look, if you go down to that 71% of investors that only buy one property, well, think about it, you know, why? When it's such a great asset class, why? They either didn't understand the cash flow or the cash flow blew out because they had to rewire the house and replumb the, you know, the sewer, and then the hot water system blew up, and then there was, you know, aggressive mold in the bathroom that was sort of, you know, not visible because of a bit of a Hollywood makeover when they bought it. This is me, by the way, all in one property when I was 23 years old. And then noxious weeds, and then a fence falling over and having to cut trees down. It cost me a fortune, and I held on to that property for way too long, as we do. And I was in way too much debt and negative. Yeah. And also the rent on that was like $200 a week. So I wasn't even getting much rent for it. So, you know, you have to understand all of those things. And that's really where I started the research on this, you know. So, but what we have been doing is looking at innovation, you know, from a company perspective. How can we help clients protect their homes with rising interest rates and rising inflationary costs, and also potentially help them to hold on to the rest of their portfolio, right? So especially when I've got clients that didn't invest initially with me, that might have had a couple of properties first and their holding costs are quite high, or the rental doesn't cover it, you know, in the way that they expected. So we've actually come up with a new product called Cala Air, and you touched on this at the beginning with Airbnb. Cala Air is quite different to that sort of style where it's like, you know, something interesting or something that specifically caters for a specific market segment. We are looking at properties that are returning. So we're looking at properties that are already completed but brand new, right? They're perfect for a self-managed super fund structure as well as any other structure. Single contract, so that's, you know, helpful for a lot of people. It makes it nice and simple, and they're beautiful properties in developments that have a huge amount of amenities so that they rival hotels. And we're investing in one specific location where pretty much all of the cool stuff. So whether you're going down to this capital city for business or for pleasure, tourism, work, it is all going to be within a 500-meter radius of the GPO, which is how we measure the dead center of the city, right? So if you had a little string and you drew around like you did at school with the 500 meters, everything would be in that catchment, right? And it has some pretty amazing events every single year. Now, we've got properties in there, like the one-bedroom properties. So I just picked an example quickly before I joined. One-bedroom property for $586,500. And if we look at we're doing the cash flow on a 65% occupancy rate, and then looking at various yields, net yields before tax of 10% and 15%, then the net cash flow before tax and after expenses. So once you've taken into account the loan repayments, the strata costs or owners corporation fees, the council rates and the property management fees, then at 10% you are netting $16,856. But at 15%, which is what the data is returning, you're netting $42,075 a year. Right now, that's on a $586,500 outlay. That's amazing. So having that extra cash flow before tax potentially then can help you with all of the other costs associated in your life, whether it's the interest rates going up in your own home or investment portfolio or the cost of living. But it also can help you pay off your home loan faster. And home loan debt is not particularly good debt, right? Because you don't get any tax benefit from it. So we would rather you load up your investment properties and then use whatever cash flow you have to pay down your home loan faster. So that's a really great strategy. And then you are debt-free in your own home, which again speaks to what we're talking about in the pandemic of this being a basic need. Okay, let's get rid of that mortgage in 7 to 10 years instead of 30 years. And when you've got returns like that, you can.
Thanks, Susan. Wow, sounds like there'd be quite a few people interested in what you're offering there. So best of luck with Cala Air. So you mentioned the strata fees and things like that. So the property is obviously an apartment, a luxury apartment.
Yeah, and the reason for that, So it's quite funny actually, because when we look at our Cala Home line, which is all we've ever done, we never recommend apartments. We've seen that they, over a 25-year period historically, they do grow at, I think it's 5.9%. It might be 5.7, but it's pretty close, right, to the house growth. But they take a lot longer, right, to have that growth. You can have a good 10 years without any growth, right? You really need to stay the course with the apartments. So that's not really helpful when you're wanting to grow a portfolio. And that's really what we specialize in, is growing portfolios that are safe and building them very quickly. The majority of my clients will invest in 3 to 4 properties in the first 5 years, right? So, and that sets them up adequately for retirement. They then don't have to think about it. They don't need 10, 20, 30, 40 properties. They can if they want, but they really don't need that. We find that when people are investing in that kind of strategy, it's not a property type that we would recommend, but horses for courses. There's lots of different investment strategies out there. We do our 2 strategies exceptionally well and exceptionally deep. So with Cala Air, it's an apartment in the CBD. Now it rivals hotels, okay, and that's why it sort of crosses not only your cool Airbnb thing because it's got all of the amazing amenity, but also hotels. And we're actually finding that the 2-bedroom apartments are doing a lot better. They're getting a much higher occupancy rate, closer to 80%, and yielding like so much higher, like $90,000 a year for a 2-bedroom property that can cost anywhere between say $750,000 and $800,000 typically. And that it's just phenomenal, and I think the reason for that is because, like I touched on earlier, if I'm a single person traveling, I want to stay in a hotel, although these apartments, we're focusing on having really good bedding and really good linen, because that's what we want, and a really good check-in process, right? Because that's what we know the that reviews are, built on. Often favourable reviews are built on that. So we're spending a bit more money on really good quality bedding and linen. So we get those reviews, so they're going to then be appealing not only to the single traveller, but also to the business person travelling, right, for work. But for the 2-bedroom property, you can have a staff member travelling with you without the cost of 2, because you've got 2 bathrooms in that as well. Or you can have a family, right? When you've got a family, having a hotel suite or a 2-bedroom hotel setup is so expensive. But the amenity in these properties are even better than hotels, with swimming pools and movie theatres. And, what a great thing if the weather's terrible and you've got children traveling with you, to have all of that amenity within the building is extraordinary. One building has got 2 full service gyms. It's got 2 cinemas. It's got 5 private dining rooms, so that, if you wanted to have a dinner party while you were down in that city and catch up with friends, you could get someone to come in and cater for it, or get Uber Eats if you want, or get pizza and have all your friends over. It's got heaps of really cool amenity, and heaps more than that. So it's a really good way to protect your portfolio, but also to grow your portfolio by having that extra cash flow. A really good way theoretically to grow a portfolio is to have a mixture of high growth and high cash. And so starting with a high cash property means that, in that first, while interest rates are high, in that first year, you're going to actually be able to take that money, save up all of that money to then invest in a house and land, and have enough cash flow coming in while it's in the construction phase, that's not going to, hurt you too much with the interest payments while you're waiting for the property to be built and you don't have any income coming in. So that's a good way to build it out as well. But other clients will buy, like what I'm finding at the moment is I've got clients who are buying 2 of these Cala Air properties and then putting down the deposits for the house and land now, because then when it's built, we're expecting inflation by then to sort of turn a corner. Certainly the interest rate should have stopped going up at that point, and they'll still be on interest only. So that's another way to look at building out a portfolio.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of insight there. Thank you for sharing the different types of strategies that some of your clients are utilising. But I think for the mum and dad investors who have been saving a lot in their redraw or offset accounts, paying a bit more into their loans over the lockdown period, this is great. They can start to invest further and build their portfolios up. But I think the more women that we have now got in Parliament, thank goodness for that. There's just a high number of women in Parliament at the moment from the recent election. And I think it's obvious in the federal budget that's just come out this week, yesterday, that they're now starting to look at how we can make housing affordability better for not only the couples and families, because the modern world involves people that are not, a lot more people who are single, a lot more single women who are getting into the market and investing by themselves before marriage. And they've actually just reformed the current housing affordability scheme that they had, where you pay a minimal deposit, like something like 2 or 5%, depending on the branch you're in. And now they're allowing couples to not only involve someone who's in a de facto or marriage relationship, but also siblings, friends, other people who are eligible. So that's good news for other people wanting to get into the market, that you're not limited to just buying with your life partner, so to speak. So, I hope that will add more liquidity and allow people to jump in and make great use of these wonderful offers that companies like yours, Cala Property, have available to help guide people with their investment strategies. So moving on, I know you've given us a lot of insight already about the types of properties, and you've talked about capital growth, you've talked about cash flow, which is really interesting because you really need to hear that a few times or work in the industry, in the biz, to understand what that actually means. So I believe capital growth is like with your houses and properties that are going to increase in price over a span of time, and cash flow would be like perhaps your apartments that are going to bring you strong yield quickly. Is that what it means? If you could just clarify for us.
Yeah, sure. That's okay. So when we do the cash flow on any property, right? So you're kind of technically right, because if you just look at the growth rates over time, we know that there's an inverse correlation between the growth rate and the cash rate, right? Sorry, not the cash rate, the cash flow, right? Returns, the rental yields, right? So if you're like, a lot of people go, I've got a really high cash flow property. I'm like, okay, where's it located? And then they'll tell me, and I go, yeah, okay. So that property is going to be worth the same, in 5 years' time, right? And probably was worth the same 5 years ago. It's like, oh no, it's gone up 20 grand. I'm like, yeah, okay, pretty much what I said, but it's in a high rental demand area. So that makes sense for that strategy at that time. What I'm looking at is that house and land, look, really simply, land appreciates and houses depreciate. So the more land you've got, the more money you're going to make on it growing, stronger. But what we're looking at, we look at the cash flow on any property to see whether it's negative or not. So just as an example, like the one that I showed you, I spoke about before, $586,000 and 500. I had a house and land that was a comparable price, yet that cash flow was going to be minus 6,000 before tax, as opposed to positive 42,000 before tax, right? Or 16,000 before tax. So what that indicates to me is we're expecting the house and land to have higher growth. And I totally agree with that. So the research that we do with the macro research really points us in the direction of the capital city and region set for strong capital growth in the first instance. And then the micro is about understanding the cash flow associated with it. But simply speaking, the cash flow that we look at is what is the cost of the property and therefore the interest payable on that. And then add up all the other, so you've got kind of like the CapEx and the OpEx, if you like. Here's your capital expenditure. What's your operational expenditure? So you've got your income, which is the rent, and then we subtract all of the costs associated with holding that property over the year. And then what that's left with is the net cash flow before tax. And it's very important you understand that figure before you invest in anything. Just as an example, I had a client who I recommended a property in Brisbane, this about 9 years ago, and he would come over from New Caledonia and he was working on a big infrastructure project in Western Sydney, one of the roads, and he had two little kids, probably like 1 and 3, like really small kids. And because they'd come over from New Caledonia, his wife wasn't working. This is well before work from home practices. And the property was going to cost them about $10 a week. And they said, we cannot afford that. And I'm like, okay, wow. All right, then this is not the property for you. And it wasn't. So we just went, okay, then don't buy this one. Like, this is the one I was going to recommend. But if that's going to stress you out, $10 a week, it's not the right property for you. And they wanted a third child and they ended up having a third child. So very good decision. So instead we went with another property for them, also house and land, but it was in a suburb that had higher cash flow. And it was, I can't actually remember exactly, but it was around $30 a week positive. And they were just like, oh, that's the big difference. And that will really help us. And I'm like, okay, some people are really tight with their budgets and what they've got for income as well. It's really important that you respect that and you understand that before investing in anything.
Thanks, Susan. I think what gets confusing for a lot of people is that we're used to the current economic data that we're seeing now with, reasonably high interest rates, although comparatively, compared to the 1990s when interest rates were closer to 16 and 17%, we are still quite low. I think our cash rate in Australia at the moment is about 3.8%, 85%, something like that. So it's still quite low compared to what people are used to who are still in the market now. And we have, just for some background, we've got about 2 million, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got about 2 million rentals in Australia. I think this is based on data that I've come across on the internet. And CoreLogic has recently done a survey on about 3,000 properties. And based on that information, they worked out that some properties are actually, in some areas, in some states, like WA, for example, it's much cheaper to actually buy in close to 60% of the suburbs in WA. and it's like only 40% of the suburbs are cheaper to rent in. So that's very interesting what you were saying about colour property, and I think Queensland and Darwin are also up there as well. I mean, Northern Territory, but WA, that's where I'm from, and to think that people are paying, especially around the city, astronomical rental rates to live, where it's cool and convenient compared to living somewhere else, and it could be actually much cheaper for them to buy. They'd probably be looking for investment specialists like yourself to get in. But the reason why I brought up confusing metrics is because recently Australia just announced a 4 billion surplus in their federal expenditure. We're not in deficit anymore, which is unusual. And that's possibly from the commodities, the money we've been making from commodities. And how do you think that's going to impact? I mean, we're expecting more population coming in soon. Is there more areas that are going to be less vulnerable to what's happening in our economy, in your opinion? I mean, these are just opinions and a discussion, but what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, look, I think it's driving behaviour, right? And this is what, this is going back to microeconomics about how price elasticity drives behaviour. And price elasticity is how much are people willing to pay, right? And still have the same thing, right? And you see it where governments are trying to change behaviour, say, for example, by introducing taxes on cigarettes so that people stop smoking, right? So instead of paying $3 for a pack of Winnie Blues, you've got to pay 50 or whatever they are now, and that was about trying to drive changes to behaviour. And it has worked a little bit, but nowhere near as much as they wanted it to. They really were targeting particularly young people stopping from smoking, and $50 a packet, yeah, you're going to have a think about that, right? But when you're looking at anything black market or anything that's addictive, there's a huge price elasticity. But when you look at basic commodities, like look at what Coles and Woolworths did with, say, the price of milk, and having that low prices and $2 for a pint of milk or whatever, 2 litres of milk, it drove behaviour because people, if you've got 4 teenage boys at home that guzzle like 20 litres of milk a week, you're just going to go, I'm going to go to the competing store, which is probably in the same shopping mall anyway, because that's a basic commodity that we need. Now, going back to basic shelter, looking at, say, some of the more expensive cities like Sydney, what do you want to spend your money on? If you've got $1 million, what are you going to do? Are you going to pay for, say, a house in way out west, like miles away from where your friends might be? And that's actually what drove that rent vesting population, where people are like, and I've had so many of those clients who are going like, I can't afford this, and I don't want a $4 million loan for one home. Even if I can get it, I want to do something else with it. So they went, I want to rent where I like and where my friends are and close to work and close to my support groups, and then I'll invest to make money elsewhere. We're now seeing, I think, especially with so many people working from home, people going, I'm so sick of renting, and rents going up unreasonably, having a lot of changes to our rental costs and also rental legislation. That's been a huge driver of change, where people are like, well, now what do we do? And I think that is driving changes in population to certain areas, like you mentioned with the CoreLogic data. In terms of the $4 billion surplus, I don't know. I mean, I think probably what is going to drive the economy more is, or what we see in terms of driving different locations. When I look at the macroeconomic that we use to look at the next, location for growth, like trying to understand the timing of the market, it's about the economy. So that plays into that with the economy. The employment is a diversified, segment of employment, population and demographics, infrastructure, and then money supply. Now, population, I think, is going to be a big driver, but it's going to be interesting too to see how, if there have been any changes to certain visa requirements. I know a couple of years ago, pretty much everywhere other than Sydney and Melbourne was considered regional Australia for visa requirements. So, instead of going to Swan Hill in Victoria and being a skilled migrant who could actually help industry in these areas that have been declining, they were going to the Sunshine Coast or to the Gold Coast going, whoa, this is the Australia I dreamt of, right? And so state governments have been working really hard to try to attract overseas migrants to live in their state. That, like Adelaide, for example, South Australia has been doing a lot of work with overseas migrants, trying to get them to stay there. I work with the Department of Immigration there, and so that's an area I'm close with helping them with supplying property that, the migrants want and need. So that's going to have a further knock-on effect. So, yeah, I think it is, in that regard, it is an incredible time to invest because, as we saw with that 1 month reprieve, bang, everyone's straight back into the market the second they can. There's still a huge amount of money there. Like you said, the mums and dads that have saved well during COVID. And also, just to break down that preconception as well, the majority of my clients are mum and dad investors, right? I don't have these very wealthy investors, a couple, but not many. It's quite an unusual thing. So I have a lot of younger professionals, a lot of singles, a lot of mums and dads that are, have young kids that are now thinking about, okay, what we do next for retirement, may or may not have their own home and may or may not want to have their own home. So, it is very accessible when you get the right information. You've got people who, like me, who understand exactly what goes into recommending a good property for investment. But I think the thing that's going to drive that more than anything else is the skilled migrants influx that we're expecting. And if the visas haven't changed and skilled migrants are, don't have any sort of visa penalty for, living in WA, for example, then why wouldn't you? If you're going to be able to walk into a job that pays, 100 grand a year, and you can buy a property that's, accessible for that, then why would you live in Sydney or Melbourne, where it's really, certain parts for an equivalent type of property? I know we've seen such a huge push of people moving to Queensland because it was so much more affordable. Definitely seen that, that's all. Affordability and also technology has been pushing the people away from Sydney and Melbourne for a long time. A lot of people think it was the COVID push, but it was actually just spurred on by COVID, but it was really brought about because of technology. So, yeah, I think we're going to see that happen more and more. But look, I think, to kind of finish on a positive note, I think that, getting the economy under control with the budget, that's a great start. That really helps, right? Then then looking at how we keep the inflation low and the RBA doing what they're doing in terms of driving that, hoping to drive that lower. It is expected that interest rates will kind of normalize again next year and then start to decline, right? So we're in for another, year or so of this. And to be honest, it's still only 6%. It's still really manageable. It's not 13%. It's not 10%. It's not 9%. That's what I'm used to. That's where I started investing. And it was still a good asset class to invest in, even though I invested in the wrong properties. It was still a good asset class to invest in because of the compounding effect of investing in property and the fact that you can leverage it, right? So there is some good news on the horizon. It's just about getting through this, but an amazing time, an amazing opportunity to invest, because the second this is under control, the property markets are going to go ballistic, especially because there is still a lag in the construction industry. We're still seeing that there is a huge undersupply Australia-wide, right? So, supply meets demand at 3%. And I was looking at Victoria yesterday, and I think Victoria was 1.7%, so that's as a whole, right? We usually use supply and demand at the very granular suburb level. But, we used to always see supply and demand, like a good area to invest was sort of around 2%. If we could get lower, then great, but we rarely did. I haven't seen anything over 1% for quite a while in the areas that we're recommending.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about, housing is a basic need. I think we just need to rethink that. And the fact that the vacancy rates are so low, I think in Sydney, based on the CoreLogic data, it's, close to 1%, if not under, or a little bit over. So that's what's driving the prices to go higher. And, the reason we talk about this is just to keep our awareness on it. You can't just jump into the market because you want to buy a house. I mean, it's great to have it on your mind, but it does take a long time to get your finances in order and to find out where you want to buy, like you're saying, what type of property suits your risk profile, because there are also these unknowns like, if you're buying to invest and you're going to rent it out, you don't want to buy, for example, in prone unemployment areas. I know there's a few of them in Sydney, like in the southwest, Liverpool and things like that have been known to. I mean, I don't want to judge people from that area, but the stats have shown that there's been even unemployment rates close to 9% there, when at the moment our unemployment rate's quite low. It's about 3.5% in most places, or around that mark. So there's a lot of investigation and research to do, like Susan has just shared with us, before you jump into a purchase because of the fear of missing out, or because the market's going to rise soon and you want to be in. There's a lot of other factors that need to be considered before you do make that first purchase. And that's why it's so great to, touch base with people like Susan who are in the market daily, considering these things, talking to the government, industry bodies, and just gaining that insight that you can't really get from reading the headlines, because the newspapers sometimes they have a particular slant on things to help sell the newspapers.
So that's very diplomatic of you, Sage. Yeah, and I think too, unfortunately, we now think that Googling is research. It's not. It's searching. It's not research. And the research that we do is really difficult to understand, a lot of the time. Heavy statistics, economics, unless you are educated in that and you really know what you're doing, you're not actually going to understand it. You also probably don't have access to that information anyway. It's quite difficult to come by, or it's expensive. We pay for a lot of research so that we have as many data sources as we can for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of points of research. So you're absolutely spot on there, Sage.
I think that's a really positive note to end on, that, we're possibly things are looking up in the long term, and we can start to get ourselves ready for our investment strategies, whatever they may be, and that there are people out there like yourself and others who can help if we have questions and want to dig a bit deeper, is what I'm trying to say. Susan, thanks so much for your time today. I think these conversations with you are really important, and I'm learning so much. Was there anything you wanted to say before we close it off today's episode?
No, look, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to make a bit more sense of the market. The questions that I get asked every day. It's really fantastic to be able to provide some insight, because it is a minefield out there. There are so many headlines. And when people like me are getting asked by the media to make sense of the media, you're in trouble, right? What chance have you got when you're relying on the media or other sources like that? So, yeah, absolutely love helping our clients. And like you said, it's easy to find us online. So, much prefer that you had a conversation that doesn't cost you anything than do something that could cost you an absolute fortune.
That's right, and we're always learning. So, this is mind-expanding stuff, really, finding out how our basic needs can actually make us money in the long term. And I can't wait to jump into the property market again, and I hope I can get the right insight to be able to make the right decisions with my financial strategy. So thanks so much for everyone joining us. Maybe next time get some questions ready, and we can see if Susan will take some questions from you. We'd love to hear what your finances are like, or your investment strategies are, and how things are in the States, because I know a lot of people out there are probably watching from America. I'm in Sydney, so is Susan, and we'd love to hear from you. So do put your hand up or reach out if you do want to say something, because that's the point of this platform, that we're all part of the show. But maybe we'll save that for next time. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you shortly on Dreams to Realty.
Thanks, Sage.
Thanks, Susan.